Here at the Seattle Atheist Church, the members ourselves give many of the talks. We have a planning meeting every quarter that's open to the whole community, where we consider suggestions for talks that members of our community would like to hear or like to give. Today, we have a very special guest. Ken Davis is going to be giving a talk on emotional foundations. Just to give some background, Ken Davis completed his PhD with the American neuroscientist Jaak Panksepp, the man that we talked about before. He's famous for discovering that rats can laugh and for creating the field of effective neuroscience. Ken is the co-author of the book Emotional Foundations of Personality, a neurobiological and evolutionary approach, and the book Animal Emotions, How They Drive Human Behavior. We're very fortunate, and I'm super excited to have Ken here today. Ken, you have the floor.
Are we ready to begin?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I thought we were going to have some music first, but I'm glad to be here, and it sounds like a very interesting group. Myself, as I told a few people earlier on, I'm most affiliated with Quakers, most of which, particularly the Northeastern Quakers, probably wouldn't be quite as insistent on describing themselves as atheists, but they wouldn't go much further than putting that of God or the light within people, and that's the kind of language that they use. So yeah, about 20 minutes here. I'm going to try to go through I'll start with the idea that we're basically mammals, and much of our brain is pretty mammalian. I'll go through the descriptions of Jaak Panksepp's 7 emotions, and then I will try to talk about. I'll try to get out of the animal world a little bit and talk about how these emotions give our lives meaning and values. And then I got a little challenge for you, and it basically deals with where emotions are created and what that means for humans, and can we blame other people for our emotions, so to speak. So those are the 4 topics that I plan to pursue. I should have started my stopwatch, I think. Yeah. So Stephen, you can keep me straight as far as time is concerned, any time constraints. Jaak was a fascinating guy. He started life as an engineer. Well, he started life as an immigrant from Estonia with his family after World War II, and amazingly spent his first couple of years in school at a one-room schoolhouse in a very rural area in Delaware, which speaks very well, I think, for one-room schoolhouses, small schools, and homeschooling and whatever. But he was going to go into engineering, and he made the mistake of needing some money, and he started working in a mental hospital evenings. And so he became familiar with these folks, read their records, whatever, and decided that emotions were really what their problem was, and decided he would switch into psychology. So he went to graduate school as a potential clinician and became very dissatisfied with the clinical methods that people were using, and decided really the only way to approach these things and really find out what's going on with emotions is to study animal minds and study them directly. And so he began a neuroscientific career exploring the mammalian mind, and his dissertation actually used electrical stimulation, put little electrodes into rats' brains in various places, and discovered 2 primary emotions for his dissertation. One, he could he could clearly identify an anger, rage, or what he called a rage attack. And secondly, he could identify aggressive behavior that would be considered predatory. And he discovered that to get those two behaviors, he had to put electrodes in different places. And he later discovered that those were two completely different operating systems in the brain. The first one was associated with a more general rage system. And the second one he later called the seeking system, and really had nothing more to do with blood and guts, so to speak, than the fact that the predator needed something to eat. And so they were basically foraging. A predator would just be foraging for food. He became obviously very fascinated with this subject, but it was very out of favor. Behaviorists really had the domination, and that's really never changed in the United States. People talk about the cognitive revolution. Well, they really just, maybe Jaak's feeling would be that they're still not interested in emotions, particularly emotions in animals, and they're really not interested in subcortical origins of emotions. And so he waited really till he got tenure before he really started digging back into to the emotional arena again. And then he added fear to his list, and he was really the first person to link what he called the sadness grief system or the panic system or whatever to endorphins in the brain. And we had a dog lab there, and it was the first demonstration. And of course, animals, when they're separated, cry, they whine. Dogs yip yip yip, chicks peep peep peep, whatever, and babies cry and so forth. And he was the first to discover that you could quell these with very low doses of morphine, way lower than would be necessary to relieve pain. And there's a whole literature now associated with that, including the use of buprenorphine as a morphine that is not very addictive to prevent suicide. Then he added lust and care. That took him up to 6. And then he spent much of his later career researching the play system. All mammals play, with the possible exception of mice. And he focused on rats. Young rats he felt were delightful creatures, and they readily played. And I think Stephen has probably seen the videos of the rat tickler, so to speak. And he discovered that he could play with rats as a hand, tickling them and kind of throwing them over like the other rats would do, and so forth. So with the play system, he had 7 primary emotions. And I wish I had everybody's video up there. Should I change that with my view? Should I have a gallery view? Yeah, let's try that. That way I could see more people. Where was I going with that? Let's see. He had 7 primary emotions. One would think that all the study of these animals and all the documentation that he had in terms of how these emotions were elicited and so forth and so on would have resolved the issue of how many emotions there really are, but they really haven't, because not that many people have listened to them, and most people are stuck in the cortical mind rather than looking at the brain as a whole. That remains a puzzling aspect of American psychology, perhaps most recently fueled by the brain imaging that is pervasive everywhere. And the cortex is a massive structure in humans, particularly the neocortex that has mushroomed out and covered the whole rest of the brain in humans. But the subcortical areas that actually are involved in the arising emotions are tiny, tiny little places. And And all of the areas that Jaak used to elicit emotions, either pharmacologically or electrically or whatever, really are in the part of the brain below the cortex, already in between the spinal cord and the cortex. And in fact, they're mostly located in an area that's just above the spinal cord. People call it the brain stem. And they're tiny places, and they do not light up very easily in imaging studies. And it requires very strong magnets, some of which at the 7 Tesla level are really bother people, make people nauseous and so forth. And in any case, so that's one of the reasons I think many studies now report neuroimaging, and it's become a dominant theme in American psychology. But basically, Jaak would have said we are mammals, and we're really, to a great extent, subcortical mammals, which is where the similarities in the brains of all mammals lie. And where the differences occur is in the cortex, particularly the neocortex, that wrinkly portion that you basically see when you see an external picture of a brain. All you see is this part of the brain that has basically mushroomed out over the rest of the brain, even though it's mushroomed out and the ear is right next to the auditory cortex. There's really hardly any way to go from the ear to the auditory cortex. It's just an accident that the brain is mushroomed out over in that area to get to from the ear to the auditory cortex. You have to go back down to the brain stem, up through other subcortical areas, and eventually back into the cortex. So it's rather a strange kind of Rube Goldberg arrangement. But so Jaak would have said people are place way too emphasis on the cortex and not near enough emphasis on our subcortical brains. And there are a number of people that are keying into that now, more so. But still, I would say 90% of all psychologists fall under the rubric of cognitive neuroscience, and that or cognitive scientists that really are not interested in. Most of them, including Lisa Feldman Barrett, that either gave a talk here or somebody talked about her, really believes everything is cortical, and doesn't even believe that Jaak has discovered anything in the subcortical brain. If you get her to talking, one of the problems also is that animals can't talk, but they can communicate to us. They can exhibit their likes and dislikes. One of the ways they can do that is if you give them a chance, put a little electrode in their brain in an area that elicits positive feelings, they can decide to turn it on. If you put an electrode in the brain in a place that elicits negative feelings, aversive states, they can turn it off. So they must be feeling something. And they also become attached to places where good things have happened to them, have had pleasant experiences, and avoid places where they've had aversive experiences. So they can talk to us, but they can basically talk to us through their actions rather than their words. Jaak also demonstrated that you could take the cortex away from an animal at birth or very shortly thereafter, and they would grow up and behave rather normally. He's got a famous experiment where he did this. He had 16 rats, 8 lost their cerebral cortex and 8 didn't. And after they grew up to an age when they were playing, he asked his graduate students to tell him which ones were intact and which ones had the operation, and they really couldn't tell the difference. And in fact, these rats like this live pretty normal lives in the sense that they can at least reproduce, raise offspring, and so forth. But there certainly are limitations. But much of their lives are intact. I'm actually going to be, I'm part of a study group now that's going to study humans that don't have any cerebral cortex. They're born that way. And our goal is to show that they exhibit at least 6 of these emotions. I typically in my work do not talk about lust. And in the book that Jaak and I wrote, we didn't discuss lust either. But that these children without a cortex exhibit all these emotions and act as if they're active agents in their world. That is, that they can do something even though they don't have a cortex. How familiar are people with these 7 emotions? You can give a thumbs up if you feel you're pretty familiar. Kind of so-so. Because the emotions are seeking, rage, fear, lust, care, sadness, and play. Let me just briefly review these a bit. The seeking system basically is kind of a granddaddy system that energizes others. The anger system defends things that you've sought and discovered that were considered important or essential for life. The fear system protects you from dangers. If you don't have a good fear system, you're not probably going to live very long. The weird thing about the fear system is it gets confused with the sadness system very often. And the fear system is very responsive to pain. And it turns out a painful experience is built into the sadness separation system as well. The difference is that in the fear system, we're talking about physical pain. With the sadness system, we're talking about psychological pain that has that doesn't have any painful any of the bodily sensations associated with it. The brain just creates this painful experience without any of the bodily sensations that create physical pain. And so you have to be kind of clear about what you're talking about. People sometimes use anxiety and worry to describe both systems. And it is interesting also that the sadness system, people talk about hurt feelings, talk about painful losses, heartaches, and that kind of thing, which are all pain-related kind of verbiage. But they're clearly different systems. The fear system, you can ameliorate, you can douse your fears with alcohol, or you can douse your fears with closely related drugs called benzodiazepines like Librium, Valium, Xanax, and the sadness system requires morphine to be quelled, and that goes back to the kind of work that Jaak did with puppies and guinea pigs, where they showed that morphine would stop their crying when they were separated from their litter mates and so forth. So all of the drugs that quell fear and sadness, however, are addictive, as are the drugs that stimulate the seeking system, like cocaine, for example. The play system is the most recently evolved emotion, and it's probably the most complex as well. The mammals are the only creatures that play. Many of the emotions are quite ancient, however, and fish and reptiles exhibit seeking, anger, and fear. But if any of the others would be extremely rudimentary. Birds exhibit care and separation distress, that is sadness also, but birds do not play. Mammals are the only animals that play, and as far as I know, every mammal plays with the possible exception of mice, and they go through a weird phase, which is kind of playful, but it's hard to see anything really come out of there that is playful. The The big confusion with play is that play is, in Jaak's sense, is social play. So playing a game of solitaire is not play. Playing a game of hearts, for example, where you can trump the other person, you're playing in groups and you can maybe trump the other person's card or play a higher card and steal the trick, and maybe take some pleasure in stealing it away from the person who thought they were going to get it, is much closer to play. Although, since one of the things people learn while they play is a sense of fairness, you don't dare gloat too much. So why did play evolve? Why is it so important? Well, it's thought that it starts people off in the social realm of interaction. Interestingly, kids roughhouse, they chase each other around, they shriek and whatever, but they do get too rough. And it's the only occasion where I think you can take an emotion where somebody goes too far, whoever it is that notices some kid that's gone too far with and gotten too rough, you can pull the kid out and tell Bobby, listen, Bobby, you can't be that rough and push Susie down. Would you like to continue playing? And Bobby will say, yes. Well, all you have to do, Bobby, to stay in the play group is to not be so rough. Can you do that? Bobby will say, yeah. So you put him back into the play group, and hopefully, at least for a little while, Bobby quits acting so rough. So it's a highly reinforcing system. And it's the only emotion also where children who need it, when they're deprived of it, really express that deprivation. Anybody in this group a teacher, an elementary school teacher by any chance? What happens on days when their kids don't get to go outside, when it rains and so forth? They get unruly. Well, they're deprived of play. And it's quite interesting. The country of Finland has now made it a policy to give kids more play. And I don't think they even take recess away from sixth graders like they did when I was a kid. And they try to incorporate much more play in the classroom as well. But as kids start playing, they become more socially oriented, and they have to start considering the feelings of other people, of the kids they're playing with. And as they get older and start engaging in team activities, they start using rules and guidelines for coordinating how they're going to play. And but they're not totally mature yet. But and if they get angry, they probably blame other people for their anger. But it is interesting that kids at say age 9 and older spontaneously start including fairness rules in their play. So play may be involved in helping kids teach to how to put brakes on their emotions and take other people into more consideration. And I would assume that most people on the call that have played after school baseball or basketball and so forth, baseball is my favorite example, have gone to lengths to make sure that the teams were fair. And they in my world, they threw a bat, and they had the two best players, and one of the best players threw the bat and the other player caught it, and they went hand over hand on the bat. And when one player could finally put his hand over the butt of the bat and touch the hand of the other player, he got to choose first, and they went back and forth. Has anybody else in this group had that kind of experience? All right, way to go, Bruce. Yeah, it's quite common, and so anyway, play is an important emotion, and people stick with it into adulthood, hopefully, and it adds a lot of fun and levity right through life. And I would say play is one of those emotions that gives life meaning and value. And perhaps the function of emotions is is to, or one of the things emotions do is to give our lives meaning and value. Each of these primary emotions has a strong positive affect and a strong negative affect. And the things that we appreciate, the things associated with excitement, with anticipating a great meal, you smell the snakes, or the snakes. We had an experience with snakes out here this weekend, but maybe a little Freudian slip in there. But anyway, the steaks on the grill and smelling them and anticipating what they're going to taste like, all those kind of seeking urges, all the care urges, taking care of people, the fun, playful kinds of interactions with folks. We like to replicate those, and they give our lives meaning and value. And unfortunately, when people are angry with us and we get angry with other people, they probably interfere with happy lives. Fear certainly is a very inhibitory kind of thing. And if you get separated and do experience a lot of social distress, either through family distresses growing up and so forth, that's certainly something you don't want to repeat. So these things undoubtedly give our lives meaning and value. It's interesting that there's one of these areas in the subcortical region of the brain. This is this, are you
just that we lost you for a moment there.
Yeah, we lost you for about a whole minute there, which is great. We start a discussion about whether birds play or not, but we have you back, so we're glad you're back again.
Okay, well, maybe let me just say that unless an animal is playing with another animal and they're interacting, flying, chasing each other, and so forth, it probably does not serve the same kind of social functions as social play does in mammals. But there's a guy named Burkhart that's over at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville that has published several papers on fish playing. And but what he's referring about is he has a weighted thermometer in the bottom of in the aquarium, and these fish like hitting this thing and watching it go back and forth. And so Jaak would call this object play. But object play, or playing without another person, is no different than playing solitaire. We use the term play, but it probably doesn't serve the same social learning functions as the rough and tumble kind of play that humans engage in. But let's don't get too hung up on that point. The kind of play the mammals do exhibit is quite common across all mammalian species, with the possible exception of mice. But Mickey, don't give up the ghost, you know? And I'll appreciate any challenges anybody wants to bring up. That's quite fine. Let's see. I was just going to say that this little teeny area in the brain, down in the brain stem, if it's damaged, it makes people inert, basically. They wake up, they still fall asleep, wake up, but they don't want to do anything. They don't engage in any activity, and they don't say anything. And the medical people call this akinetic mutism. They don't show any emotions, any interest in anything, any engagement, whatever. And so even though they've got a complete cortex, damage to this structure wipes out the expression of any emotion, which is a pretty potent argument for Jaak's case that the perioccipital ray and other subcortical areas are critical for these emotions that give our lives meaning and add value to our lives. and really add a dimension to our lives that we wouldn't have without it. It becomes very complicated, however, to debate this with people that strongly believe that the cortex is really the main part of what deals with the human behavior. But I'll just. How many people have actually read Animal Emotions? Anybody here read The Emotional Foundations of Personality that Jaak and I wrote? Animal Emotions is a real easy read. Emotional Foundations is a pretty easy read. I think most people in this group could read the book. Jaak's other books, Affective Neuroscience and the Archaeology of the Mind, are very difficult. But there are other places where you can get his material. There's one other interesting idea that I'd like to share with you, and that is who is responsible for the emotions of adults. Let's skip children. They start out just responding to the triggers and so forth, and they gradually learn to manage more and more and become better of their emotions, became better integrated socially. But adults, wow, we should be able to manage our emotions quite easily, correct? Oh, I get Barbara and Bruce are agreeing that they are even having trouble. And I'm going to shake my head also. Wow. Managing your emotions, in my experience, is a lifelong learning experience. And but you often hear phrases like, "He made me angry." Or the opposite side, "Oh, I want to find a partner that makes me happy." And this totally bypasses the notion that all of your emotions basically take place between your ears. They're generated between your ears, and many people argue that the chief function of the cerebral cortex is to put brakes on the emotion. And if you got a functioning cerebral cortex, you should be able to regulate these things. But these blaming statements are very self-centered statements, and life pretty much starts out as self-centered. And part of the trick in life is to perhaps develop to the point where you're no longer just triggered, but have some ability to constrain inappropriate emotions and maybe to elevate more appropriate emotions. The question is, do you have the capacity to choose how you react to life's frustrations? Are you a puppet? Are you obliged to react to somebody, pulling your emotional strings, so to speak? Anybody here familiar with Viktor Frankl? A few heads nodding, hands going up. He's famous for the phrase that no one could take away my freedom to choose and how I respond. And I can't imagine, living in a German concentration camp, but he describes vividly in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, that, he was totally responsible for how he responded to some guard kicking him or whatever, which Jaak has suggested that we are born very self-referential and self-centered, and that much of psychotherapy, I'm going to read this so I can get it right, involves deconditioning and what he calls recontextualization of emotional self-centeredness that would enable a person to accept one's negative feelings, especially as one's own and not of others' making. And that ends the quote. But my follow-up to that is, indeed, how can one understand one's own role in creating a problem, such as a failing relationship, if the other person is always at fault? This is owning one's own feelings is a long time philosophical argument, I believe. And if anybody here can clue me in or tune me in to where those ideas originally come from, I would appreciate it. I got a couple examples here from a business perspective. How likely is it that a department manager who is frustrated, experiencing maybe low-level anger with the poor performance of the department employees, can he improve the performance of these employees if he's criticizing them generally for not following his directions perhaps, and repeatedly making mistakes? Is it possible that the department manager might have a major role himself in creating the poor performance? If the same manager fired all of his or her incompetent employees and the replacement employees exhibited the same poor performance, what would he conclude? Probably, it's difficult to find good employees these days. I recently heard a therapist who was also seeing a therapist at the same time in what she called a continuing growth journey. Heard her say, how can I see things differently if I'm blaming others for my feelings? In the business scenario, maybe we would simply substitute blaming others for my department's disappointing outcomes. And perhaps wisdom requires owning our emotions and our tertiary emotional reactions, which if practiced would be likely to increase our effectiveness as active agents in our world. But as many of you have already indicated by nodding your heads, it may be easier to do than it actually is. It sounds easier to do than it actually is. So that concludes my prepared comments, stemming from Jaak's early career to the primary emotions that he discovered, and whether they provide meaning to life, which I think they do, and people that lose the capacity to express these don't seem to have any meaning in life, to the point where part of the adult challenge and the developmental challenge is to learn how to own one's own emotions and to not simply be a puppet whose strings are pulled and one is obliged to react to the satisfaction of the person pulling the strings, or to the confusion of the person pulling the strings, if perhaps both people are confused about where the sources of these things come from. Any questions?
Well, thank you, Ken. Before we get to the questions, can we please unmute our microphones and give a quick round of applause? That was great, Ken.